Western civilization is in a war. We should, frankly, test every person from here who is of a Muslim background, and if they believe in Sharia, they should be deported. Sharia is incompatible with Western civilization. Modern Muslims who have given up Sharia, glad to have them as citizens, perfectly happy to have them next door. But we need to be fairly relentless about defining who our enemies are. Anybody who goes on a website favoring ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups, that should be a felony, and they should go to jail. Any organization which hosts such a website should be engaged in a felony. It should be closed down immediately. Our forces should be used to systematically destroy every Internet-based source. And frankly, if we can't destroy them through the Internet, we should destroy them with kinetic power, using various weapons, starting with predators, and just, frankly, just killing them.
Polls have put the numbers of American Muslims who believe they should have a choice between U.S. law and Sharia over the 50% mark.
Well, do you support what Newt Gingrich had done, that we should, what he said after the Nice attack, that we should have essentially a religious, not religious test, but, well, I mean, it's essentially a religious test. He basically said, you know, if you're Sharia compliant, you're out of here, and if you're not, then you're not. I don't know how you implement that. I think there's constitutional problems, but you support that.
I support that. If the Muslim is Sharia compliant, that is in direct conflict with the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, but no one's going to admit that, because then they know they'd be kicked out of the country.
But, well, let me finish. Mm-hmm. If the break point is Sharia, and Islam is the only major religion that encourages lying, the taqiyya says you have to lie to the infidel. You lie to them if you have to. So if you look at a Muslim and say, hey, are you lying? And they go, no. Okay, you're in. Absolutely. Okay, you're out. I mean, if they lie, how do you vet something like that?
Well, then how do you implement the test that you want to implement?
Well, then the question is, why do we have Muslims in the country that how can you possibly vet somebody who lies?
Well, so are you suggesting that we deport all of the Muslims in this country?
I'm suggesting we have a discussion about it, that's for sure. I am absolutely suggesting we figure out how do here's what we should be doing. We should be monitoring every mosque. We should be monitoring all social media. We should be we've got 3 million Muslims in the United States. We've got 1,000 active FBI investigations going on right now. I mean,
Khizr Khan, the Pakistani-born lawyer, has a history of promoting Sharia, the Islamic legal system going back as far as 1983, asserted my friend Warren Mass in a profoundly misguided essay for the New American Magazine. During that year, Khan defended Sharia in an academic paper entitled Juristic Classification of Islamic Law, which he wrote while studying in Saudi Arabia. He stated, and this is presented once again as a quote, it is not, the invariable and basic rules of Islamic law are only those prescribed in the Sharia. All other juridical works, at this point there is an ellipsis, must always be subordinated to the Sharia. Warren comments, presumably, all other juridical works include the U.S. Constitution, to which Khan pointed during his harangue. It wasn't a harangue, it was a very modulated speech at the convention. This is an example of lying by ellipses. It is ubiquitous. Here's the full citation in context from page 50 of this academic paper that was produced as a way of helping non-Muslim lawyers and legal advisors who want to do business with people in Muslim countries understand Islamic law. There is some value in understanding the legal system of country in which you want to do business. With the exception of the Quran and Sunnah, every other source, chief or supplementary, has been a matter of controversy as to its validity or definition. There were some jurists who even considered the Holy Book, on which depends the very authority of the Sunnah, as the sole basic source of all Islamic jurisprudence. A careful examination of those sources and of the extensive researches relating to them would further distinguish the line that separates the first two sources from the rest of the sources. In other words, he's placing what Muslims consider to be scripture at the apex of Muslim law. If you want to understand Muslim law, you have to go back to the source, and everything else is merely ancillary. It's just dicta, in other words. The latter, meaning the rest of the sources subsequent to the Quran and the Sunnah being stories about the way that Muhammad, the founder of that religion, put that religion into practice. The latter were introduced at least a century after the Prophet and were built upon opinions of individual jurists. Such opinions should be subordinated, as in fact they were to the Quran and the Sunnah, and not placed above them. In other words, he wasn't talking about the United States Constitution and making that subordinate to Islamic law. After reviewing a handful of traditional interpretations and applications of Islamic law, binding upon Muslims and not upon non-Muslims, Khizr Khan wrote the following: "The structure of Islamic law, the Sharia, was completed during the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad in the Quran and Sunnah. This brings up an important fact which is generally overlooked, that the invariable and basic rules of Islamic law are only those prescribed in the Sharia, Quran and Sunnah, which are few and limited." That's an interesting expression. It reminds me, quite frankly, of James Madison's description of the powers delegated by the Constitution being few and defined. It's the same principle. If it's not written down in the law, it cannot be imposed as law, and in this context, imposed as law only within the Muslim faith community. Let me repeat this. This brings up an important fact which is generally overlooked, that the invariable and basic rules of Islamic law are only those prescribed in the Sharia, Quran, and Sunnah, which are few and limited. All other juridical works which have been written during more than 13 centuries are very rich and indispensable, but they must always be subordinated to the Sharia and open to reconsideration by all Muslims. He's referring specifically to the writings of Muslim jurists and applications of Islamic law that are customary or common law. He's saying that these are rules that apply to cases. They do not apply generally to people living within the jurisdiction of Muslim countries. And all of those applications of the law have to be open to reconsideration. What this means in practice is that where there are customs and habits and institutions and practices that are not specifically authorized in the texts that are considered definitive by faithful Muslims, meaning the Quran and the Sunnah, where these practices and institutions and customs exist, they can be revised and disposed of. And that refers to inter alia, such things as female genital mutilation, which is a practice without authorization in the Quran. It refers to all those things that are advertised as part of Sharia law, but Khizr Khan is somebody who believes in Islamic law as pertains to his religious devotion and his religious commitments. He says those are not part of Sharia law. They should not be considered part of Sharia. He's saying, in other words, that there is a perfectly valid legal way forward for Muslims to abandon all of the things that supposedly embody the worst aspects of Sharia law. They can grow, they can develop, they can progress. And that's a point that's actually made by Brohi in this supposedly controversial keynote address he gave back in 1980 about Islamic law and human rights. As Schopenhauer used to say, it is no doubt easy to talk about morality, but without religion, you cannot make it effective. This is a Muslim lawyer quoting Schopenhauer, I want to emphasize. The only real sanction of morality in the last resort is in religion. The moral values are supreme in the sense that they are not subservient to any other value. It is the function of morality to tell us what is right and proper to do, and it is the function of law to enforce such moral matters as have a direct bearing on the regulation of the life of man in relation to his fellow men. He who acts contrary to moral law is therefore acting against the law of human evolution. He was not using the term evolution in the Darwinian sense. What he's saying is that if you get the principles right, then the application can change. We learn, we progress, we grow, we abandon mistakes, we abandon previous assumptions that are in conflict with morality. If you're interested in knowing how to apply these principles in our contemporary society, you have to understand the principles. And you have to understand that this vast corpus of writings by jurists and philosophers in the Islamic world, those things are disposable. You have to blow those away like so much chaff in order to find the kernel of what these people really believe. And once again, this is binding only upon those who accept that religion. The same thing is true of halakhic law in Judaism and various forms of canon law in Catholicism. The same is true of ecclesial law in Mormonism and other faith traditions. This is not controversial, or at least it shouldn't be. Dr. Ben Carson, who is an adherent of a faith regarded by many to be eccentric and off-putting, Seventh-day Adventism, has regurgitated the standard caricature of Muslims and their Sharia law by saying that the pious Muslim has a duty to Allah to see to it that Sharia law becomes the law of planet Earth. In response to this, a friend of mine, Will Coley, who is a convert to Islam, an observant Muslim, and national director of a libertarian group called Muslims for Liberty, says that rather than seeking a centralized or despotic theocratic state, Islam in its original manifestation promoted a decentralized social order in which the believer enjoys unmediated access to God and all men and institutions are equal before the law. From Coley's perspective, Sharia law, Sharia meaning the way or the path, does not require universal submission to Muslim rule. Instead, it dictates that Muslims are to respect the liberties of those who follow a different faith. And once again, this is the perspective of somebody who is a libertarian and a devout religious Muslim. He points to the third qaida, or maxim. This maxim states that non-Muslims are not required by law to follow Islamic religious and social standards, such as proscriptions against the consumption of alcohol or restrictions on sexual conduct. And that maxim is rooted in one of the authoritative statements attributed to Muhammad. Once again, I don't have a brief for Muhammad as a prophet or as a moral teacher. I'm pointing out that this is in the written text that Muslims consider to be authoritative. Over the centuries, as Khizr Khan has pointed out, Islamic legal scholars have fleshed out the 5 great maxims of Islamic law, devising common tenets and applications that are recognizable, I think, to Americans who understand due process and property rights protections. 2 of those maxims should be immediately recognizable to people who are familiar with the writings of 19th century Christian libertarian scholar Frederick Bastiat. Quote, "When it is forbidden to take a thing, it is also forbidden to give it, and when it is forbidden to perform an act, it is also forbidden to request its performance." What Bastiat wrote was that since an individual cannot lawfully use force against the person, liberty, or property of another individual, then the common force, for the same reason, cannot lawfully be used to destroy the person, liberty, or property of individuals or groups. Tragically, in both Christian and Muslim history, that principle, which is the political application of the Golden Rule, has been honored more in the breach than in the observance, as Shakespeare might put it. The same maxims of Islamic law require respect for contracts and strict application of the written provisions, and I'm quoting once again from these maxims of Islamic law. In principles, words shall be construed according to their real meaning. Where there is a text, there is no room for interpretation. However, the same maxim says, where application of its principles are concerned, Islamic law allows for adaptation. I quote once again, which means that in much the same way that Western common law has outgrown its medieval elements, it is entirely possible for the Islamic tradition to do likewise, unless we assume that non-Muslims who are insuperably hostile to Muslims on the basis of identity have a better insight into what these people think and what it is that they aspire to. I have no interest in being ruled under Islamic law because I have no interest in being ruled by anybody, full stop. I am just as ill-disposed to the prospect of being ruled by supposed Christians who want to destroy the property rights of my Muslim neighbors. The highest law, the only law to which I subscribe, is the Golden Rule. One application of the Golden Rule is the second great commandment, which is that I am to love my neighbor as I love myself. I am to be just as zealous in the defense of my neighbor's rights as I am for my rights and the rights of my family. And that certainly applies to my neighbors who are Muslims. Thank you for joining me this week on Freedom Zealot Radio. Please join me online at freedominourtime.blogspot.com. I'll be back with you again in a week, and until then, as always, dum spirito pugno, while I breathe I fight. Good night, God bless, and may we send the state back to the hell that spawned it.
What do you want to do now, Captain?
The same thing we always do. Fight 'em in